Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to satisfy investor demand for ESG metrics using software. I'm Paige Regas, the demand generation specialist at IsoMetrix, and I'll be the host and moderator of today's webinar and panel discussion. Our speakers today will be Yaowen Ma, Principal ESG Analyst at Verdantix. We also have Shannon Lardi, our Partner Enablement Manager here at IsoMetrix, and Michael Day, the Head of Sustainability at IsoMetrix. Here's a little about Yaowen. He has 9 years of experience conducting EHS and ESG research and a dual bachelor's degree in environmental management and international relations. He also has a master's in sustainability management. And here's Shannon. So before coming to IsoMetrix, Shannon started her career in the US Marine Corps and went on to spend nearly 2 decades at ExxonMobil in various roles, including socioeconomic management advisor. Her expertise lies in driving EHS efficiency with technology and implementing business intelligence tools. Prior to joining IsoMetrix, Michael spent 20 years working for corporates in the waste management and chemicals industries, including Noryan and Kimberly-Clark. He was a subject matter expert in environmental compliance and sustainability. Okay, on today's agenda, Yaowen will kick off the webinar by breaking down all 3 elements of ESG and sharing data-driven insights into how investors are currently evaluating ESG programs and metrics. Following the presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with all 3 speakers to explain how technology can be used to not only streamline ESG reporting, but to build an ESG program that will meet and exceed stakeholder expectations. And finally, we'll finish the webinar with a live audience Q&A. And here's a little bit about IsoMetrix. We are one of the world's leading providers of enterprise software for governance, risk, and compliance, or GRC. For the past 25 years, our mission has been to focus on delivering hyper-agile and fully integrated solutions for environmental, social, and governance, which we'll discuss today, sustainability, environment, health, and safety, enterprise risk management, internal audit, and compliance. We have offices in Atlanta, Toronto, Perth, London, and Johannesburg, and we have implementation partners on 4 continents. So IsoMetrix really is geared to service organizations at a global and a local level. You can see our software is award-winning. We have 25 years of experience and the highest customer retention rate in the industry of 95%. Our software is also deployed in 100+ countries. All right, Yaowen, I'm going to pass it over to you now to introduce Verdantix and jump into the presentation.
Thank you, Paige, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. I'm very excited and looking forward to our webinar, as well as being with the co-presenters, Shannon and Michael. So for those of you learning about Verdantix for the first time, welcome as well. Verdantix is an independent research and advisory firm. We do specialize in environmental health and safety, ESG and sustainability, operational excellence, and smart buildings information management. In terms of today's research, it will be focused on research and advisory that we have produced during the past year, specific to ESG and sustainability. The ESG and sustainability research practice focuses on information and advice for investors, tech providers, financial services firms, as well as corporate executives. And we examine a number of topics across research and the full range of services and technologies required to succeed with ESG and sustainability management. A quick disclaimer, we are an independent research and analyst firm. That does mean that we do not endorse any particular vendor, product, or service covered in our research publications. Having said that, we are looking forward to sharing a couple of perspectives around the market landscape for ESG and sustainability, and also what we found in terms of market trends, market analysis, and especially best practices with data management systems specific to ESG and managing risks and identifying opportunities in this market landscape. In terms of today's webinar, we will be covering a variety of topics looking at investor trends, demands, and practices as far as ESG integration goes. We'll then dive into the different types of frameworks that corporate executives can use to assess and identify ESG risks and opportunities, And finally, we will have a panel discussion deep diving into the different perspectives around the challenges and opportunities with using data management systems and different technologies to help you improve ESG, operational risk, and performance management strategies. Now, when we think about today's market landscape and today's market circumstances for ESG, there has been a huge surge of interest in ESG and sustainability-linked financial services. Sustainable bonds, the issuance has been forecasted to reach in excess of 600 billion dollars in 2021. Assets under management in terms of ESG funds has nearly tripled as well since 2010. In the US, more than 1/3 of US domiciled financial assets now involves some aspect of ESG integration, and impact investing is a part of this picture. Impact investing is essentially an investor saying, I'm just going to focus on a specific issue, say climate change, renewables, or EV, and measuring the ESG impact associated with these types of investments. While COVID-19 has been an accelerator of this market trend, there's a lot of good reason behind ESG adoption, which has accelerated over the last 12 months. In this survey that you're seeing here, conducted by Morgan Stanley, of the largest roughly 100 asset owners active in the market, over 40% agreed strongly that ESG practices is an additional lens to identify more competitive, more profitable businesses who can compete in the long term. The significant majority of those did also cite that ESG factors are a risk mitigation strategy to reduce their exposure to undesirable events. An example of this is the concept of stranded assets, which has been linked to climate change. Stranded assets being assets that have suffered premature, earlier than originally anticipated, write-downs or depreciations, for example, the early retirement of coal plants. What this means for corporates and executives listening in today's webinar is that investors are looking to avoid greenwashing. They are doing this with intentionality. They're actively trying to assess corporates in terms of ESG factors and sustainability risks, and they are looking to assess and understand how corporates are practically integrating ESG into existing EHS and environmental risk management systems. Now, we are also seeing increasing regulatory intervention accelerate demand for ESG visibility. This chart here comes from data by the UNPRI, and it very visually illustrates this growth in regulatory interventions. Recent regulations we've tracked include the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which came into effect earlier this year. We've seen the EU lead previously around chemicals compliance, and they are continuing to do so with ESG regulations as well. Some of these regulations do pertain specifically to financial services and their investment portfolio practices, which continues to serve as an additional driver for why ESG will continue to be scrutinized by investors and therefore by CFOs and general counsel executives. One of the questions we often get is, how exactly do investors integrate ESG into their actual investment due diligence and decision-making process? And the truth is, when we look at this chart, there is a wide spectrum of behavior depending on the investor's time horizon, the risk appetite, the type of strategy that they're looking to achieve. Historically, we've seen ESG investors veer to either extremes. It could be focused more on negative screening to the left, or it could be focused more to philanthropic and impact-first returns on the right here. In more recent years, mainstream investors have also come to acknowledge that investors driven by the consideration of sustainability do achieve better ESG performance and financial returns over the long term. And this captures both the risk management piece as well as the opportunistic elements of ESG and sustainability returns. Perhaps most importantly for many corporate attendees in today's webinar, many investors are also conducting these assessments with or without the presence of corporate executives in the room. The UNPRI source here did find that most investors will report on their own ESG practices or policies. For example, they may be a signatory in this case to the UNPRI, but only a handful will go so far as to engage issuers directly on their ESG practices. So the pressure is very much on corporate executives to engage and educate financial market participants on your ESG practices. The next part of this webinar talks about a few different frameworks that can help you dissect and manage ESG information as a result of these market drivers. The topics that fall under ESG are very diversified and broad. So as we look at this diagram here, the environmental category can include broad sweeping topics like climate change, resource depletion, waste and recycling, pollution and deforestation. When we think about social factors, they can affect both your firm, your facilities, as well as the suppliers that you work with. Issues like human rights, modern slavery, child labor, diversity, equity, and inclusion in more recent years. And some of these are increasingly being regulated as well, if we think to the US conflict minerals regulation. More traditionally, for some investors, governance has been a topic of focus too. Board structure, independence, accountability, anti-corruption practices, even taxation, and the thoughtful transparency around political lobbying efforts is something that investors may require disclosure on. So when we're thinking about these different types of frameworks, historically, there have been a few that have been used in the past, and it can be a very daunting prospect when we think of executives responsible for disclosure of these topics. The GRI shown here is the oldest and longest standing in terms of the framework to capture all the information, all-encompassing, to identify the full footprint of E, S, and G for a particular firm. DJSI, CDP, the IIRC have also gradually placed more emphasis around metrics and issues considered financially consequential topics. SASB here, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, has presented one of the more industry-specific frameworks to help you prioritize issues most pertinent to investors. So in this particular diagram, what you're seeing is an example SASB heat map of the top ESG priorities by industry. And going down the rows are the different ESG issues, such as greenhouse gas emissions. Going across the columns are the industry verticals, the different types of businesses that firms would be operating in. Now, you may think, for example, that firms should prioritize climate change mitigation because it is systemic. But actually, if you look at the first row going across GHG emissions, there are only a few sectors that are significantly exposed to any potential business model risks or regulatory risks associated with GHG emissions. And that would be extractives, food and beverage, transportation as the top three. If you're in the technology sector, for example, energy consumption of data center, the customer privacy, the employee diversity, equity, and inclusion factors would be ESG issues considered more material as a result of SASB's engagement with different asset owners, asset managers, and investors. This particular framework has been adopted by a number of financial services entities and investors themselves. What you're seeing here is a diagram from HSBC that shows their industry-specific perspective, which is built on top of the foundations of SASB. And even for corporates, SASB is a great resource to help you identify the top ESG factors most likely to require engagement with investors. It is worth noting that the SASB framework is a starting point for most sophisticated investors. Even within the same industry, materiality is specific to your own business operations, dependent on geography, dependent on stakeholders. And finally, I did want to highlight climate risk and the TCFD framework. It is one of the newer frameworks that is available on the market. Increasingly, it is being adopted by countries like the UK and New Zealand in terms of regulatory mandates. Beyond reporting For the sake of reporting, what the TCFD framework really tries to do is encourage management executives and board directors to assess the financial value at risk from climate change specifically, ideally in a scenario-based manner and directly linked to your income statement, your cash flow statement, as well as your balance sheet. So for example, how does climate change affect your ability to access capital and financing? Will you receive favorable interest rate loans as a result of your ongoing business operations? Are certain assets likely to see earlier than anticipated write-offs? Is there an opportunity for you to align your business operations with revenue growth in a 1.5 Celsius degree scenario world? And a great example of this is Neste, which is a Finnish headquartered company who have executed on this thinking by shifting their fossil fuel oil production business to selling more products such as sustainable aviation fuel, which is produced by using 100% recycled cooking oil. That type of product is now being sold and used by the likes of American Airlines, JetBlue, and others in select flight routes within the US. So with that said, we will be having a panel discussion around the importance of ESG data management systems, best practices, and some of the potential pitfalls there. From a Verdantix perspective, we are seeing a large number of ESG data sit within environmental health and safety software solutions in particular. What we found is that corporates are dependent, very often early stage currently, on a number of software solutions to meet their ESG information management needs. So it can be a mixed patchwork in terms of the types of systems you may need to integrate. Facilities data and energy consumption across buildings may be within your building management system. Supplier code of conduct might be in your procurement or sourcing software. But when we map the issues to software systems, the ESG data very often we found does sit in EHS management systems. We have also seen a gradual maturity in corporate practices from disclosure and reporting more towards ESG risk and performance improvement. So if there are a few new innovative tools that can help you better manage visibility into ESG risks. Stakeholder engagement tracking is one example of that. Project management in terms of local community social license to operate, in terms of digital media, stakeholder sentiment monitoring, also in terms of geospatial analysis of climate risk or product LCA and eco-design solutions. And to summarize this particular perspective from what we've seen in Verdantix research, there are 5 interdependent use cases most commonly seen for corporate ESG software solutions. We have done a number of benchmarks across more than 40 different vendors and the solution offerings here. But really, when it comes to innovations, there are 4 types of categories that we see as being well positioned for growth over the next 3 to 5 years. Real-time risk analytics is the first. Operational ESG program management is the second. Product stewardship and product LCA type solutions is the third. And of course, disclosure and reporting specific to financial value at risk from ESG concerns. So with that, I will hand over back to Paige, and I believe there are a couple of questions that have come in as well.
Thanks, Yaowen. That was a great presentation. Okay, well, now I'd like to jump into our panel discussion. So let's bring in Shannon and Mike here to unpack some of the challenges of ESG reporting and how software can help. Okay, so Shannon, why don't we start with you? In your experience working for a major oil and gas company, what were the challenges associated with collecting raw ESG data and then turning that into refined outputs?
Sure, Paige. So I think from my perspective and my experience that especially for global operations, risks can vary by location, and there needs to be context to manage those risks in the form of ESG engagement and provide stakeholders and shareholders with the most accurate and quality data. So it's really about finding a way that you can measure that ESG data, finding the right metrics to capture that data, and also how you obtain that data. And sometimes because it's so global and the risks are different in different areas, the data can be very inconsistent in the way it's captured. And so it makes it difficult for a business to turn that data into meaningful analytics to measure their performance.
Thanks, Shannon. That's actually a really great point that you make about inconsistency and variability of the data. We've definitely heard it before from our own clients. A lot of our clients need to collect hundreds of different data points to report to standards like GRI and SASB. So it makes it all the more challenging when data is inconsistent. Can you just maybe provide a couple of examples of the type of data you're referring to?
Sure. I think if we're talking about stakeholder engagements, a lot of times it's how do you meaningfully capture those engagements, both externally with people within a community to establish meaningful consultation so that you can provide evidence of those engagements. And some of the other and even environmental data sometimes, depending on the thresholds, the standards change, and it's difficult to make sure that you're capturing all of those standards and staying up to date with all of those metrics.
Thanks, Shannon. Mike, I want to also address this question to you. Your experience is a little bit different. You were focused more on the environmental side, and your background's in chemicals and waste management, but I'm sure you probably faced some similar challenges. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure do, Paige. Thanks for the opportunity. As Shannon said, not only do we have data being generated in different areas of the globe, but in many cases through different systems. Consolidating that data into usable outputs is the challenge. First of all, getting the data into an integrated system so that you're looking at all that data together and able to evaluate your risks, across different operations, across different regions, countries, but then, visualizing that data to see what it's actually telling you. Getting that data into some type of integrated system is a very important tool to have so that you can, understand, again, what the data is telling you. And it may be coming to you in numerous different ways from different systems. Some of the data may be integrated into the system. Other data is being hand keyed into the system. So as I say, it's important. It's a challenge, but it's important to get that data into a system that you can then get an output from the system that allows you to actually utilize that data.
Thanks so much, guys. Those are all really great points. And to kind of continue on that note, Yaowen's presentation made it very clear that technology can help combat some of these challenges and streamline ESG data collection and reporting. So on that note, why don't we unpack exactly how it can help? Yaowen, I want to start with you as somebody who's studied these technologies extensively. I know you've watched numerous product demos. So yeah, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I would definitely second some of the points that Shannon and Michael has mentioned. When we assess corporates and work with them around ESG information management architecture and the backend system, what we found is that for most firms, at this point today, they're still juggling many different databases, point solutions. ESG data is sitting across many different departments, never mind geographies or facilities or offices. So the biggest challenge is really centralizing all of that information at this current point in the market in terms of making sure there's firm-wide visibility, accessibility across different functions who want to access a specific piece of ESG data, and also improving the data record keeping and accuracy of the information. When we think about the investor interest in ESG data, increasingly there are higher demands for the quality, the accuracy, the standardization of the different metrics. So auditable workflows and the ability to have strong audit trails at the data level is becoming increasingly important as we move towards the next phase of ESG data management systems. And part and parcel of that is perhaps more real-time access to ESG data to the extent possible that you're no longer thinking about annual frequency of reporting, but perhaps quarterly, monthly, weekly. We have seen instances where especially energy sensors for building infrastructure you're getting much more granular access into both the frequency and accuracy of the data for ESG visibility of risks.
Thanks, Yaowen. That was a really great answer. So next I want to talk to Shannon a little bit, because I know you were actually involved in deploying IsoMetrix software at a company where you previously used spreadsheets and legacy systems to track and manage your ESG data. So I think our audience would be interested in hearing a little bit about that experience, particularly what it involved and how it ultimately facilitated ESG data collection and management.
Sure. So I think from my corporate experience, we actually integrated IsoMetrix in where it was across global locations, where the data was captured in sometimes in different formats, sometimes just as we've said, in spreadsheets or legacy systems. But I think mostly it was collected in non-standard ways, to where it wasn't easy to roll that data up. And so the effort to actually consolidate that data was an enormous effort to do. So I think that technology, the way it really helps streamline the data collection, and the way that IsoMetrix helped us, was to give us a standardized format, a centralized risk management system. It actually also brings the ability to detect gaps in processes through that analytics. Once we've captured the data, it allowed us to find areas to make continuous improvements in how we're collecting that data. And it actually also increased the awareness of the nature of risk across the business, and prevented that duplication of effort across regions, and sometimes even within the same department. Sometimes it reduced that duplication of effort, because it was establishing a system where it was easy to see those analytics and what had been captured. And then I think lastly, one piece that is a key component was the integration, and how it really could reduce relying on multiple resources to input that data. It brought that visibility immediately to tell us things that we needed to do to make better business decisions.
Thanks, Shannon. So having everything in one centralized system sounds like it really saved you a lot of time. Can you give us an idea of around how much?
Well, that's hard to pinpoint specifically, but I mean, I would say, because you're reducing the amount of resources, not only to collect the data, but also to report on the data, because it's already in the same system, having that built-in analytics gives you the reporting right away. So there's not a need for, so you're saving quite a bit of time, months worth of work to actually consolidate and prepare that data to report on it.
Well, that's really significant then. And Mike, you also worked at organizations using multiple point solutions for your ESG data management before you switched to a single centralized software like IsoMetrix. Can you explain why you made this switch to begin with, and if it delivered on your key objectives?
Sure, Paige. The main reason for the switch was, kind of twofold. First of all, efficiencies, like we've talked about. There was a lot of effort that went into pulling data together on a monthly or quarterly basis, from multiple sources and from multiple different systems throughout the company. The other thing was consistency. Anytime you're dealing with data, and I think Yaowen just alluded to this, data integrity, is a big part of the process. And when the data is being collected in multiple different ways from multiple different systems, then the question comes: if I'm comparing data from one facility to another facility in another part of the world, am I really comparing apples to apples here? So it's very important to get that data consistency. And that's harder to do when you're working across multiple systems. And then the other thing is having everything in one system where we can actually check the data and make sure that, we've got data outliers being identified, so that I can quickly look into the data and find out, if there were data entry errors, or if I've got some type of process upset that is, resulted in a data outlier. Again, going back to that whole idea of integrity of the data that you're using within your system.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so let's move on to our next topic here, which is around the common perception that ESG and sustainability do not directly translate to ROI. We've seen it, and oftentimes the data that actually shows that poor ESG and sustainability performance is leading to unnecessary costs tends to be buried in silos across the organization. So Mike, you mentioned earlier that you had a lack of visibility into ESG data before using a centralized software. Did that make it challenging to secure budget for your ESG projects, whether it be investment in technology or other initiatives?
It did. Many of the projects, when you start an ESG system or you implement an ESG software, there's going to be an initial cost to that. Sometimes you get pushback on that initial cost. So that's got to be justified by saying, what are the cost savings down the road that we're going to get from implementing this system? Some of those costs are very quantitative, man hours saved, that type of thing. Some of those costs are more qualitative, talking about the fact that we're producing better data, that we're able to produce a more concise report or a more comprehensive report. In the instance where you're talking with investors, when those investors are looking for that data, if I can go ahead and give them a very good, comprehensive ESG report, then that tool that I've implemented has probably paid for itself.
Thanks, Mike. Those are all really great points. And Shannon, you had to go through the same experience of building a business case to move forward with your ESG projects and initiatives. Did you face similar challenges?
Absolutely. I think the first thing that initial challenges with getting budget is number one, it's the timeline. Usually they need the solution immediately. And so it's a timeline to pilot the solution, but also securing that budget. It's usually not available when that demand is needed. And really, especially with any kind of social engagement, stakeholder engagement activities, the earlier you can engage with stakeholders and the earlier that you can provide evidence of that engagement, the earlier you can understand and assess the impacts of any of those risks that can occur and the overall impact on even your corporate performance. So, and I think part of that, I think some other challenges are getting cross-functional alignment, especially if it's an area where it's a shared activity across departments. You need stakeholders to align on those metrics, internal stakeholders to align on what those metrics are, and in order to determine what can be included in the scope of a project, and in order to then obtain budget for that. And I mean, this, essentially helps determine accountability for those activities on impacts of risks that you're looking at for each of those departments, and who's going to be responsible to make sure that they're tracking and monitoring to actually continue to ensure that the quality of the data that they're capturing can actually improve as they're capturing those analytics, and again, making better business decisions proactively rather than waiting to make a decision because of data, because it presents itself on down the road.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Yaowen, so now this is going to be for you. You have studied sustainable business and consulted with so many companies on their sustainable strategies and their ESG strategies, and you've done so much research on it. Is the perception that sustainable business does not directly translate to ROI, in fact, a misconception? Or do you have any research or evidence that proves otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think related to this question that Shannon and Michael both touched on is associated with better performance management as well as better visibility into risk management. And the best way to think about this in practical terms is to look at past precedent as well. When we think about PG&E, for example, who had to just come out of bankruptcy because they faced over billions of dollars in liability that was directly linked to climate change and forest fires caused by the utility lines and the utility infrastructure, combined with excessive drought in the region of California. When we think about Rio Tinto, they were expanding their operations into Aboriginal heritage sites, and they had all the legal permits that they needed to do that. but they didn't quite secure the local social license to operate that they needed to be able to do that. And they faced a lot of local protests that not only disrupted the operations, but ultimately the CEO of Rio Tinto had to step down as a result of the consequences of some of that disruption. Now, in terms of upside, there are evidence that we've seen across different industries that would suggest ESG directly contributes to not just revenue, but also EBITDA margin as well. So the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business did, I believe, find that over 50% of revenue growth within the consumer packaged industry came from sustainability labeled goods during the period of 2013 to 2018. And this was a North American specific study. If we think about other more ROI specific initiatives, green building certification is a great example. If you can certify your buildings to LEED or Energy Star, typically those properties would command a 10% to 15% rent premium as well. So that's a direct contribution to revenue and as a result, EBITDA margin, as we think through different types of issue-specific investments through technology to derive that. Now, when we think about the financial market that we operate in today, I do also think it's important to stress that financial markets evolve over time. We know that the SEC and the EU have made statements around concern of potential misrepresentation of ESG data. So there is increasing focus on what the role of regulation is and what the requirements are for improving ESG data, the auditability of that, and the role of data management systems to help you improve your visibility into ESG performance. We've seen engine number one partner with BlackRock to engage ExxonMobil around the governance of ESG. We've seen Shell face litigation in terms of the requirements for decarbonization efforts now. So financial markets are shifting, and it's important for corporate executives to try and make assessments, not just on revenue growth, but also on risk management.
Hey, another issue that I think Yaowen kind of touched on there is that, especially in the environmental space where I've done a lot of work, most of your environmental sustainability parameters directly link to operational efficiency. So when you think about reducing water use, reducing energy use, reducing waste, all these tie directly to your operational efficiencies and result in better profitability for the company. So getting a handle around those metrics directly ties back to that.
Thanks, guys. So just to give us an idea, Mike and Shannon, you've deployed this software. Can you give us an idea of how quickly you were able to see ROI after deploying a management system? Shannon, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I would say it takes, because it does take time for you to actually, piece together and deploy it, but because of the nature of the IsoMetrix software and how their process for implementation flows, we were able to deploy the software within 6 months of when we started the project. And I mean, pretty much immediately you're seeing reduced need for resources to capture that data because it's an automated way, and even having even having contractors put data into the system because it's a cloud-based software. Actually, you actually have that less hands-on the data where it gets directly into the system. So you pretty much saw that win within 6 months of the implementation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, it depends on your deployment schedule and how much of the software you're deploying. Obviously, if you're deploying just a couple of modules of software, it's going to be a much quicker deployment process. If you're deploying all the different modules that are available in the IsoMetrix software, that's probably going to be that 6 to 9 month deployment process. But once everything is deployed and the users are up to speed on actually using the software, then the savings start to multiply immediately from that.
That's great, guys. Thanks so much for your input. Okay, so now moving on to this next topic. IsoMetrix for the past 25 years has worked with companies in high-risk industries like oil and gas, mining, solid waste management, utilities, a lot of the same industries that our listeners are coming from today. So we already know these industries are highly regulated and they've already been practicing sustainability and corporate social responsibility for years. So while the term ESG may be new, they already have a handle on the concept itself. Yaowen, what will these companies have to do differently to succeed with their ESG strategies, if anything?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it also comes down to the shift in terms of how ESG and sustainability information management has evolved and is being used over the last 5 to 10 years. And when we think back to the frameworks, they perhaps best articulate some of that evolution, with GRI being all-encompassing, covering every single ESG issue under the universe, and all the different potential metrics and KPIs you can use to report on environment, social, or governance topics. But in recent years, the focus has been a lot more around what are the specific issues that are financially material, and that can be different based on industry, based on where you're operating, in the West Coast versus the East Coast, for example, where the West might be more drought risk focused. If you're in Maine, that might be more around snowstorms and other types of winter-related risks. So geography, the type of stakeholder, the type of industry, all have a direct impact on the type of issues that are potentially financially material. Now, Michael did also mention operational efficiencies as being one way to improve ESG performance. Social license to operate, proper operational ESG risk management, these continue to be essential to businesses in terms of their ability to maintain ongoing business of operations. As I mentioned earlier, the Rio Tinto example, compliance is not sufficient in today's market environment in terms of managing your ability to access markets, sell into markets, and maintain a competitive position to then grow from your existing infrastructure. Now, for some sectors that are more carbon intensive or have large exposure to physical infrastructure, there may be a need to also assess the financial value at risk from climate change. And that could come in two different variations, either climate risk in terms of the physical infrastructure and what you might need to invest or be careful of as we head towards a 2.5 in excess of 3 degrees Celsius scenario, or it could be in terms of business model transition. So Neste was the other example that we had talked about earlier, where businesses are starting to shift some of their revenue streams to capture what could be a 1.5 Celsius degree scenario world and the types of products and services that would sell best in those situations.
All right, thanks, Yaowen. So now that we've kind of addressed what these high-risk industries need to do, I think we should also talk about those industries with slightly lower environmental and safety risk. Many of those industries are focused on or familiar with at least one area of ESG, and I'll display the different areas here on screen so you can see. But now they're being pressured to be transparent into all three elements, so it can seem overwhelming. For a company just starting out, which element is most important to focus on from the get-go and why? Mike, you worked pretty heavily on the environmental side of things, so why don't we start with your view?
Sure. I would say that there's not any one area. This is not a cookie cutter approach. As you said, every company is different. I think companies need to consider, as they roll out an ESG program, consider their maturity across the different programs. Where they're ready to roll things out, where they need some improvement. Maybe where they need that system to make the improvements they want to need. And also consider where are their pain points. If their problems are really around workforce issues and community issues, then they're really going to want to focus on that social area. If their problems are more associated with pollution and releases and environmental issues and carbon footprint, then focus on the environmental side. if they've had governance problems, obviously, that's where they need to go. But the key is that materiality assessment that Yaowen has mentioned before. Going ahead, and assessing those different areas and figuring out where the big impacts to their operations are going to be and where their risk lies.
Thanks, Mike. That's an excellent point about conducting a materiality assessment. Yaowen, this webinar is about investors. So do we have any insight into which element of ESG investors are looking for right off the bat?
It's a tough one because historically speaking, governance perhaps is the most mature in terms of investor interest in assessing corporate governance practices. We've seen in the past a number of accounting related scandals that have directly led to new regulations as well. Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, around what corporates can and cannot do in terms of the audit, assurance, and reporting environment. In ESG, there is increasing discussion and attention towards the importance of data quality, audit, and assurance within the ESG reporting value stream as well. In terms of the specific issues, though, you do need to go through this assessment on an industry by industry, in fact, corporate by corporate perspective, which the SASB framework helps investors begin to do as a starting point, but it does require a very customized approach specific to corporate issuers, specific to the type of financial instrument or fixed income instrument we're talking about. For corporate executives listening in on today's webinar, I would recommend SASB, TCFD, GRESB type frameworks. If you're a real estate firm, for example, these are good places to start in terms of the standards bodies, already having engaged a large number of investors and giving you that starting point and foundation in terms of understanding where investors are coming from, what are the risks they perceive as being most pertinent to your particular industry vertical. And from there, your continued own materiality assessment will be essential to ensuring you really customize your engagement efforts to your specific stakeholder requirements.
Thanks, Yaowen. Those are some interesting points. Shannon, did you want to add anything based on your experience?
I do, actually. One point I wanted to make is that just as Michael and Yaowen both said, I mean, there is no single element of ESG that should be focused on, because if you think through it, even an environmental issue can have an impact on social. And if it's not governed appropriately, then you're going to actually have an overarching impact on all those areas. So it's really ESG, they're all equally important. One cannot really exist without the other. But governance certainly is a key to ensure there is a sustainable solution to manage that and manage change and manage the consistency of how you're capturing that data. But I would say that governance actually positions a company for that oversight to understand what environmental and social elements, where the greatest risks are in the business. And again, just as Yaowen mentioned, it is different with each industry. It can be more environmentally focused than social, but I think there's going to be aspects of ESG in every one.
Thanks, Shannon. All right, so moving on to the next topic. You guys have, from what you said so far, it's pretty clear that ESG there's a lot that goes into it. It's too big a job for one person, probably too big a job even for one team. So I think our listeners might be interested in hearing which departments actually need to be involved and who should have ultimate ownership of the ESG program. Mike, who had ownership of the ESG programs you've been a part of, and did it work?
I guess ownership was really in the sustainability group for the most part, at least from my experience. And they kind of drove things from there. But I think the important thing to understand is that ESG, as you said, is not something that just affects one department or is managed by one department. It really, there's no right answer to who should have ownership. It really depends on the organization. But I think what you really need to focus on is an integrated approach. Get out of silo management. The last thing you want is the environmental department only managing the environmental stuff and not talking to the public affairs department. So, they have no idea what's going on there, so that when you have an issue, an environmental issue that affects the public, nobody knows how to deal with it or what the message needs to be. So I think it's very important to get out of that silo approach and get into an integrated management approach for ESG. And one of the things that requires is an integrated system to manage all your ESG risk, so that we know when those risks cross those programs and we understand what the overall risk is associated with the issues, and to present it to the company.
Thanks so much, Mike. So now I want to be conscious of everyone's time. So I am going to just skip ahead a little bit to the last topic of the panel, which is about how ESG, Yaowen, your presentation made this pretty clear, but ESG is expected to retain its momentum over the next 5 years and probably beyond that. So this topic is going to be around what steps organizations can take to ensure they're prepared for this. Yaowen, as somebody who studies and advises on this topic, can you give some advice?
Yeah, I think for most firms, we've seen a slew of decarbonization and net zero carbon targets over the last 12 months. And the immediate question that many corporates will be asking themselves is, what are the right technology tools that we need to have in place to help us achieve those targets and manage visibility into those KPIs and metrics? So number one is always making sure you have not just a centralized software platform in place, but one that has strong data management systems, one that gives you the ability to track social license to operate and engage with stakeholders in a project-specific and social sentiment-specific manner. Being able to use the auditable workflows within a data management system to ensure you have the consistency of data collection in a way that is standardized across your facilities, your operations, your regions. These are all important aspects of data management that corporations will be increasingly focused on over the next 2 to 3 years. Beyond that, it is really around firm-wide visibility into the types of ESG risks that may affect their business model or their operations. We've discussed materiality assessments and cross-functional collaborations as ways to make sure you are internally structured appropriately to be nimble and respond to these types of concerns. And related to that is figuring out the right governance structure. And I know Michael alluded to this, but at Verdantix, we are seeing very early stage variations in the types of cross-functional committees being established, reporting to the board of directors for ESG management. And increasingly, sustainability is also reporting into the CFO and having general counsel be involved as well, given the sensitive nature of having accurate ESG data.
Thanks so much, Yaowen. That was all really great information. In the interest of time, Shannon, do you want to finish with your advice?
Sure. So I would say, and again, I'm going to take right off of what Yaowen said, a strong data management system. But it's really, a company needs to select a solution, a software, a vendor that fits your priorities and capabilities. And that materiality assessment is kind of your first start to do that. But you also know that there's lots of software options out there like IsoMetrix that actually come with solutions built in based on experience and based on things that they've done with multiple industries across many companies. So choosing a software vendor that really aligns with your business culture and will grow with you, and you can complement each other throughout the process. Including all users in the process as you're defining what that is and doing that materiality assessment, talking from the corporate level down to people out in the field, because they may be capturing the data and need to understand what the importance of the consolidation of that data is. And engaging early could bring lots of improvements to business processes and make really quick wins and reduce that kind of load up front for putting that software in place. And then the last component that I'll say is that leveraging partners to help you implement, using their expertise in change management. They can add a ton of value with their experience on different platforms and can really bring a lot of value as you're doing a new implementation.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. I think that was some excellent advice. And on the topic of software, I do want to take a moment to quickly share a little bit about the IsoMetrix solution. We do have a powerful ESG management system, and I'm going to show you a couple of outputs that you might be interested in. So here on this slide, we have our actions overview dashboard, which offers visibility into all outstanding ESG actions across an organization. You can filter by completion status of the ESG actions, by the line manager responsible, the employee responsible. You can even filter by the business unit with the outstanding or completed actions and by module instance. The dashboard is completely customizable, and it provides a really clear picture of your ESG program as a whole to facilitate analysis and effective program management. On this slide, we're showing IsoMetrix's ESG reporting dashboard, which provides visibility into all ESG questionnaires a company has received. You can use this to monitor the number of questionnaires received per business unit and gain visibility into the status of those questionnaires to ensure they're on track to be completed on time. So you can see how many are awaiting sign off, how many are overdue, how many are in the planning phase, etc. And lastly, here, I just wanted to show the common ESG standards that our system allows companies to report on. So you can report on one or more of these standards, and depending on your goals, view real-time analytics and comprehensive dashboards. So this is pretty much it. And these were just a couple of the outputs our system has to offer. So we're really just barely scratching the surface of its complete functionality. We just published a new ESG solution brochure on our website, so I encourage you all to go and download it from there to learn more. And just to reiterate some of the advantages of our ESG management system, it does allow for end-to-end processes to be considered. It is a central and secure system so that you can avoid the siloed approach to managing data. So you're integrating all your ESG data coming from all the departments. It reduces the time-consuming task of gathering data and reduces duplication of work. It provides a holistic view of risks and performance. The system gives you the ability to create value beyond reporting because, again, this is a management system. So you can manage your ESG risks, incidents, and identify gaps that need to be addressed. It allows you to generate required reports for all your internal and external stakeholders. So whatever graphs, statistics, or reports need to be generated, you can do within the system. It's completely configurable and flexible so that it can cater to your organization as your goals shift, the organizational structure changes, etc. And of course, because everything is documented within this system, you do have proof of responsible management of all of your ESG aspects and actions. So I'd like to take some questions from our audience. We'll open the floor to them. I already see we have a couple that came in. Okay, so this first one, Shannon, is for you. So Shannon, in your experience, you used IsoMetrix globally and different modules across different sites. What was the need for a system like IsoMetrix?
Well, initially, what we liked about IsoMetrix was that it allowed us to do it was fit for purpose. So because it was module based and you could actually select certain modules depending on what the risks were that you were evaluating, it was easy to configure, and especially for global operations, it allowed you to kind of do, make slight adjustments to that configuration to meet site specific business requirements. I would say that the other piece that was good was the agile approach. It enabled projects to deploy the software quickly. It allowed us to take one approach and make a few slight changes and then adjust at different locations. And then I think the final piece was really we wanted a strong vendor relationship and a willingness to adapt to our organizational change, as you mentioned, which can happen quite often, especially as businesses are trying to adjust to changing market conditions and changing investor requirements and changing regulations. That ability to adapt quickly and have that good relationship with the vendor to adapt with you was really, really important.
Thanks so much, Shannon. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks to our panelists for sharing their insights. If you have any additional questions for our speakers that you didn't ask, please feel free to contact them using the emails on screen. For demo requests and product information, you can fill out the contact form on isometrix.com. Thanks again for being part of the webinar, and I hope you found the information useful.